you all for being here. It's a great honor. It's a great venue. It's a great audience. And I've been interested in the problem of consciousness for many years, going back 45 years roughly since my college days in the late 60s. And when I went to medical school, I was interested in the brain-mind problem and wound up in anesthesiology because my future chairman said, if you want to understand consciousness, figure out how anesthesia works. And so I did, and I've been an anesthesiologist for 40 years. And I'm still fascinated by the problem of consciousness. When I put my patients to sleep, and I wonder, why are they here in the first place? What is consciousness? So that's the question before us. And consciousness is really the most important thing there is. Without it, we have nothing. So what is consciousness exactly? So there are many ways to study consciousness. And we take it for granted that when we open our eyes, the world out there appears inside our head. Now we can also have internal states. And being, the world out there, appears inside our head. And being is meant to imply conscious awareness. The brain does many things that are not conscious. In fact, it's quite active under anesthesia. But being in this talk, whenever you see it, implies consciousness, having awareness, phenomenal experience. It's even hard to define consciousness, but we all know what it is. You know it, you have it, I have it, although we can't prove it. I can't prove that you're conscious. You can't prove that I'm conscious. It's a problem in anesthesia because we can't say for sure our patients are unconscious. Nonetheless, you know what it is, and I know what it is. So we're not going to spend a week, as some conferences have done, trying to define it before we explain it. But how do we, it's approached through many disciplines. Starting at the top left, the neuroscientist probes the brain with electrodes, and then roboticists and artificial intelligence people try to emulate consciousness in computers and robots. The artist tries to capture the essence of consciousness in artwork. The physicist tries to understand reality, the nature of reality, and that's Schrodinger's cat, which is both dead and alive, and we'll come to that later. The psychiatrist has his subjects look inside and go deep inside their mind. The anesthesiologist looks suspiciously like me for some reason. He tries to understand consciousness, how anesthesia works. The meditator, of course, looks inward into his or her own mind. And the Western philosopher, like Plato over there, also ponders the nature of consciousness. All these different approaches. It's a very interdisciplinary question. Now, there are two general views about what consciousness is. The first one, and probably the most popular one, is that the brain is a computer which produces consciousness as output. And we've heard a lot about this, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a minute. But this is the general view. The brain's a computer. It does a bunch of stuff, and consciousness appears as the output. But who looks at the output? That's the problem. Who's inside looking at it? That's the mystery. The second view that many people hold is that the brain is a receiver, like a radio or television, which tunes into consciousness present in the universe. So consciousness is out there, and we just tune into it somehow. I think that both of these are partly correct. Let's begin with this question. When did consciousness arise in the history of the universe? Here we have the universe from the Big Bang up until fairly recently, with some landmark events. And when did consciousness arise? Where did being arise? Now, many people would say that consciousness is fairly recent and occurred in humans or species just below humans with the advent of tools or language. Others would say consciousness occurred with animal life, with eukaryotes, several billion years ago. Others would say consciousness began with life, with first life, from 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. And still others would say consciousness began before the Big Bang, or preceded the Big Bang, and actually may have caused the Big Bang and gave rise to the universe. Let's boil that down to one question in particular. Which came first, life or consciousness? So I'm picking just one point on that line. And neuroscience, psychology, Western philosophy, the brain as computer view would say that life came first. Consciousness evolved as an adaptation of living systems, someplace since the advent of life. On the other hand, Buddhism, panpsychism, Vedanta, Hinduism, spiritual approaches would say that consciousness came first. Life followed and evolved because of consciousness. Life might have even originated to access and take advantage of consciousness. And Roger Penrose and I have suggested in our recent paper that evolution is driven not by survival of the genes, but to optimize consciousness, to feel good, as it were. There are a couple seats up front if somebody wants to come up, and some over there. So come on up. Now, in Western philosophy, and this is meant to be Plato, Plato observed that the world out there is all in his head. So light enters his eyes, bing, he has a moment of conscious experience and sees the outside world. The world is his consciousness is a representation of the world out there. However, he also realized that this meant that he didn't really know what was out there. He only had the representation of the world in his head. And to prove this point, or illustrate it, he came up with the allegory of Plato's cave, of the prisoners who could only see their shadows on the cave wall. So for them, two-dimensional activity was reality. They didn't know there were 3 dimensions or 4 dimensions at a time. And some people take this to imply that there are more dimensions or there's a deeper level of reality to what we see. And that may be true, not necessarily dimensions, but deeper levels of underlying reality. Now, Descartes said in the 17th century, following on Plato's idea, that we don't really know what's out there. And in fact, we could each be a mere brain in a vat, fed information by an evil genius. So here we have a brain in a vat, fed information by electrodes from a computer, and the brain is thinking, bing, I'm walking outside in the sun. And for that brain in a vat, that's as real as our reality is. But this implies that consciousness and reality may both be illusion. And in fact, modern philosophers like Daniel Dennett, who's very popular, says that consciousness is an illusion. There isn't any such thing as consciousness. It's an illusion. An illusion of whom or what is a question that I've never heard answered, and I don't think he's right. But we don't really know that reality is true and is as we see it. And we don't know that your reality is the same as my reality. So these are all mysteries that are still out there. Now, in Eastern philosophy, consciousness pervades a deeper level of reality. In Eastern philosophy, being is everywhere. We are essentially waves in a sea of consciousness, according to Eastern philosophy. We'll come back to that also. Now, back to modern science and the brain as a computer. We know the brain is made up of many, many neurons, 100 billion or so neurons that can be active or not active. They're connected to each other by synapses that can have variable strengths. And this is very similar to computers, which consist of nodes and connections, which can be varied. And so since the 1950s, it's been thought that the brain is a computer, and in fact, that's been an assumption. The brain must be a computer, and people have tried to build computers along the lines of the brain and understand the brain along the lines of computers. It's kind of a back and forth. And this is a very, very prevalent view. Accordingly, in the last decade or so, there's been a lot of time and effort and money spent on brain mapping, where with electrodes and other techniques, every neuron and every connection in the brain is mapped with the idea that taking that map and putting in a computer and simulating the connections, or what's called the connectome of the brain, would result in all the functions of that brain occurring in the computer, including consciousness. So therefore, if the entire brain can be mapped and every connection can be mapped and simulated in a computer, that computer would have consciousness. That's the argument. And this is this is in the area of brain mapping, artificial intelligence, AI. The singularity, Ray Kurzweil's idea that when we map all the neurons that we will have consciousness, and also that we could therefore download our own mind somehow into a computer so that when our bodies give out, we could exist in the computer indefinitely. The Blue Brain project at IBM, the Human Brain project in Switzerland, many projects in the United States, all are based on the idea the brain is a computer. Map all the neurons and synaptic connections that connect home, and that would reproduce brain functions, including consciousness. Just give us trillions of dollars. That's the bottom line. Now, how's that going? Actually, not too well. For example, a few people, actually a worldwide consortium, got wise and said, before we wait, it's going to take a long time, if ever, to map every connection in the brain. Why don't we begin with a nervous system that we know about? Now this worm, this simple worm called C. elegans, has been studied for many, many years. The entire nervous system, its brain consists of 307 neurons, which you see mapped over on the left and then illustrated here, is known. And so every neuron, every synaptic connection of C. elegans was mapped into a computer, and a simulation was done. And they had a big fanfare and a big build-up, and on a certain day they were going to let it stimulate it and see what happened, and nothing happened. The brain, the worm just lays there. It doesn't have any behavior. It kind of twitches a little bit, but it doesn't swim around. It doesn't have any worm-like behavior. So worms, they can swim around. They can do various things. They're alive. They're fairly clever. But the simulated worm, based on brain mapping, did nothing. Something is missing. Now, on the other hand, the worm has 307 neurons. On the other hand, if you take a single cell paramecium, it's one cell, it doesn't have any synapses, it's fairly clever. It swims around, you see it swims into an obstacle, it backs up, it goes the other way. It can learn. If you suck it into a capillary tube, it escapes faster and faster each time. It can avoid predators. It can avoid obstacles. It can find food. It can find a mate and have sex. In fact, here we see two paramecium having sex. It's X-rated slides. Pornographic. We don't know when the paramecium is conscious or not, but if it is conscious, during sex is the most likely time. In fact, the pleasure of sex is probably a motivating factor in evolution and reproduction. And in fact, the only time the paramecium is absolutely still, which in the quantum paradigm would avoid decoherence, is when they're having sex. But the point is that the single cell paramecium, just one cell without any synapses, is pretty clever. So I keep telling my AI friends, simulate a paramecium, but so far none of them's been able to do it. Now, how does the paramecium do it? Perhaps we can learn from the paramecium. So on the left, we see that the paramecium has these hair-like projections sticking out all around it. And these are both sensory organs and motor organs, like oars. So when it bumps into something, it bends these hair-like structures, and then they move in a coordinated fashion like oars, and it swims away. Now, if we cut a cross-section of each of those cilia, they're called, and we have cilia in many parts of our body, in our lungs, our GI tract, all over the place, we see that it looks like this. So here's the cilium here, and it's made up of 9 pairs of structures with a central pair called microtubules. And then if we look at one microtubule, we see it here. This is a microtubule. It's found not only in paramecium, it's found in all of our cells, particularly in nerve cells. And it's a lattice structure, a polymer about 25 nanometers in diameter. And how does the cilium bend? It bends because these dynein motor proteins, which use ATP, chemical energy, contract in a coordinated fashion, so the cilium bends in a purposeful, useful way, and they're all coordinated. And in 1974, biologist Atema suggested there were propagated signals which said, okay, you bend, you bend, you bend, so that they do so in a concerted fashion, suggesting some kind of information processing in this cilium. Now that's a paramecium. The exact same activity occurs in our neurons. So here's a neuron at the bottom in blue. This going down here would be an axon, and these are dendrites. And out here would be synapses. And materials that need to get to synapses here, here, or here are synthesized in the cell body, in the big part over there, and then are transported along microtubules inside the neuron, inside the dendrite, by these same motor proteins, dynein, that cause the cilia in the paramecium to bend. And there's two types of motor proteins, dynein and kinesin. And so let me do it this way. So a synapse out here that needs material made here has to have it transported as cargo along the way. It has to jump from microtubule to microtubule, has to know to go left or right. And so the question is, how does that happen? And it turns out that there are proteins called tau on the microtubule that acts like traffic signals and tells the kinesin, get off here, this is your stop, kind of like a FedEx code or something like that. And this is the coding mechanism that allows the kinesin and the dynein to deliver their cargo to a particular place. Now, tau you might have heard of because in Alzheimer's disease, shown here, the microtubules disintegrate and the tau, shown in blue, fall off the microtubule. So, and the neuron loses its shape. Now in Alzheimer's, there's the amyloid plaques, which are outside the neuron, and there are the neurofibrillary tangles inside the neuron, which correlate with loss of cognitive function. And so when the tau falls off, the microtubule destabilizes and disintegrates, or maybe it disintegrates and then the tau falls off. That's not clear, but that's the cause of the loss of cognition and memory in Alzheimer's disease. It also happens in addition with multiple anesthetics called postoperative cognitive dysfunction, or POCD. So very young people, babies who need multiple anesthetics for certain congenital problems and they need a lot of surgeries, or old people who need a lot of surgeries, they kind of lose their marbles. They kind of lose memory function, cognition, and it's because they have a picture very much like Alzheimer's, where their microtubules fall apart. Now let's take a step back and talk about the whole brain. And we're back to Plato. So when Plato sees the tree, the light enters and it goes from his eye through the optic nerve, which is not shown here, into the thalamus, which is kind of the central processing for sensory inputs. And information goes in 3 waves before we get to consciousness. In the case of vision, the signal goes to the back of the brain in V1, and in the second wave to the front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex in wave 2, and then the third wave results in Bing, results in consciousness. Now, it's interesting that under anesthesia, the first wave continues, the second wave continues, only the third wave is blocked. And this is very strange because the neurotransmitters are the same, and everything else seems to be the same. It's only the third wave that's affected by anesthesia, and we use the first wave and the second wave for evoked potentials under anesthesia for example, in spine surgery, we stimulate, or the physiologists stimulate the foot or the arm, and we measure from the brain to know that the spinal cord is okay. So it's only the third wave, and that's been shown with all types of anesthetics study. Now, what happens when the third wave gets to the cortex, gets where it's going, and consciousness happens? There's another set of 3 waves. The thalamic inputs go into layer 4, and from 4 they go to 1, 2, 3, and 6, and from 1, 2, 3, and 6 they converge on layer 5 pyramidal cells. The giant pyramidal cells in layer 5, which seems to be where consciousness is located, or is most. It may occur elsewhere, but it happens there most likely. And Bing seems to be located in these pyramidal cells, and then the axons come down after the consciousness occurs and say, move my hand, or raise your hand, or speak, say something, and controls behavior. And these apical dendrites that arise vertically give rise to EEG. Now let's look inside the pyramid, and we see those same microtubules, which integrate inputs to before firing. And these are the giant pyramidal neurons, the origin of E and G. And you see that the microtubules are interrupted in a mixed polarity. And they're supposed to be they are part of the cytoskeleton, structural support. So you would think for structure, you wouldn't want to break them apart into little pieces. You wouldn't want your femur and your thigh to be broken by its side by side. So this is not for structure, it's for some sort of information processing. And they're actually in mixed polarity, which may give rise to resonances, which I'll talk about later. So this is the most likely site for consciousness at the end of integration in pyramidal neurons in the microtubules. And on the far left, we see the structure of a microtubule. It's made of individual proteins called tubulins, which are these peanut-shaped proteins that can have multiple different states, and suggesting that they may be processing information and interacting. And in fact, that is what I think is happening. So microtubules and pyramidal neuron, dendrites and soma are the most likely site for consciousness and also memory. So let's talk briefly about memory, which is another mystery. Now, most people would say that memory is in the synapse. So this is a paradigm of memory that goes back 50 or 60 years called LTP, long-term potentiation. It was shown by Bliss and O'Keefe and others in England that if you have a neuron on the top, we just see its axon, and you stimulate it intensely but briefly, that you get a prolonged increased sensitivity at this synapse. So that after that brief intense stimulation, that synapse becomes very sensitive, so that it will respond to at a lower threshold. And this is thought to be memory because it guides activity through a network. But the problem is that the proteins that we see here at the synapse are transient. They're only there for hours to days, and yet memories can last lifetimes. And so the memory must be stored somewhere else. And what looks like is happening is that the synaptic activity activates an enzyme. It activates a number of things, but including this enzyme CAMK2, which is a hexagonal protein, which then latches on to microtubules and phosphorylates something in the cell that can encode memory. So I got interested in this and wondered what it was in the cell that was being phosphorylated, and naturally thought it might be microtubules. Now, CAMK2 is a very interesting and beautiful molecule, I think. On the far left, you see it before it's activated. It's a hexagon, and at the top we see we're looking down at it, and at the bottom we're looking at the side. Now, the synaptic activation brings calcium in, and calcium causes CAMK2 to transform, literally like a transformer, those toys. And 6 legs or arms, depending on how you look at it, go up, and 6 legs go down. These are called kinase domains. And they have phosphorylation sites here that can deposit phosphate bonds and energy to some repository in the cell that could encode memory. So, being a hexagon, I saw this and I wondered, well, I wonder if microtubules, which are hexagonal, might be where they're going. And we did the study in 2012 showing that the CAMK2, and the top B and C, we see the microtubule lattice, 2 types of microtubule lattices, and we showed that the CAMK2 exactly fits the geometry, size, and shape of the microtubule lattice. So what we proposed was that the CAMK2, which we call the nanopoodle, because this nanoscale kind of looks like a weird poodle to some of us, comes down on a microtubule, lands, and the 6 kinase domains, up to 6, match the microtubule perfectly and can phosphorylate and encode information, and leaving 6 bits of information behind. It can be all 6, or it can be any combination. And 6 bits is also a byte in computer terms. A byte is usually 8 bits, but it can be 6. So we suggested, and I still think, that this is where memory is encoded in microtubules, and it can be hardwired and involved in cognitive functions. Now, this raises the general idea that microtubules are computers that I mentioned previously, and I got interested in microtubules when I was in medical school in the early 1970s. Actually working in a cancer lab because they're important in mitosis. And I was just learning about computers at the time, and it was also discovered then that neurons were full of microtubules. So I began to suggest that microtubules were actually performing computing, were processing information, and published a bunch of papers in the 80s and later about classical computing as opposed to quantum computing in microtubules, and then later with Roger Penrose, quantum computing. So I got this idea that microtubules were processing information, and I went around to a lot of AI neural network meetings saying that microtubules were the computers. And it was a very unpopular idea, and it remains so for the following reason. The brain mappers or the AI people or the singularity people who were trying to map the brain and gain equivalence of brain processing in a computer were assuming that there are 10 to the 11th neurons in the brain, each having 1,000 synapses firing or being active about 100 times a second, giving 10 to the 16th operations per second per brain. So Kurzweil's singularity said, well, when we get 10 to the 16th operations per second in a computer, we'll have brain equivalence, it'll be conscious, you can deposit your consciousness in your computer if you pay us enough money, or something like that. And then I would go around and say, no, that's not the case, because if you look at the microtubules, and if you think about a paramecia, that can't be right. So if you think about the microtubules, you have 10 to the 11th neurons, the same 10 to the 11th neurons per brain. You have 10 to the 9th tubulins, the subunits per neuron, switching at about 10 megahertz. And we now know from other work that I'll get to later that the microtubules vibrate at about 10 to the 7th hertz. So this gives 10 to the 16th operations per second per neuron. So what I was saying was that each neuron had the capacity of what they were saying the whole brain had. And therefore, the whole brain would have something like 10 to the 27th operations per second for the entire brain. Well, they didn't like me very much. And, go away, you bother us. Don't listen to him, he's crazy. Because it meant that their goalpost was much, much farther downstream, and they had much more work to do. But then one day, in about 1990, somebody said to me, okay, wise guy, let's say you're right. Let's say there's all this information processing. How would that explain consciousness? Love, joy, feelings, emotion, envy, greed, feelings, all that stuff. Consciousness, awareness. And where's consciousness? Where's the being? Is something else required? And could it be quantum physics? The reason I say that is the same person suggested I read a book by Roger Penrose who was suggesting just that there was something else involved. And so I did. And it kind of changed my life, actually. I read this book, The Emperor's New Mind, by Roger Penrose. He wrote it in 1989. And it was many things. It argued against consciousness being a computation. He said, for example, computers can do a lot of great stuff, a lot of complex processing, but they don't understand anything. A computer might beat you in chess because it can algorithmically see all the possible moves, but it doesn't really understand the game. And John Searle's argument of the Chinese room argument, he called it, where someone who doesn't understand Chinese is given a lookup table with each Chinese character and its English equivalent, could actually translate, but didn't really understand Chinese one bit. So understanding is not a computation. And Roger argued that understanding needed something outside the system, something that was non-computable. And what that was, he went through a logical argument and claimed that it had something to do with quantum mechanics and collapse of the wave function as the only source of something non-computable and non-algorithmic. So I hadn't really gotten into quantum mechanics, quantum physics then, and didn't understand it. And I have to say that still, to this day, nobody really understands it because it's so weird and bizarre. But that's also what makes it kind of interesting. So let me give you in fact, Richard Feynman said that anybody who claims to understand quantum physics is either lying or crazy. Now, let me give you a simple version. This is my yin-yang version of quantum and classical. The world is divided into two realms, quantum and classical. The classical world we're very familiar with. It's the world we know. Newton's laws, electromagnetics, the gas laws, gravity, et cetera, et cetera. Everything's predictable and definite. But in the quantum world, things are completely different. Basically like this. So in the classical world, everything is localized in one place, act like a particle, and fairly large. But the large-small cutoff is unclear. We don't really know the cutoff, and it can change. In the quantum world, things tend to be smaller and can exist in quantum superposition, which means that they can be in two or more states or locations at the same time. This microphone could be here and here at the same time. And yet, we don't see that, and that's the mystery. So in the quantum world, things are non-local. They can be spread out. They can be connected over distances, quantum entanglement. They act more like waves than particles. But we don't see these quantum superpositions in the classical world. We see definite things. And this is called the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. Because if you make Niels Bohr and others at the turn of the 20th century noticed that if you make a measurement on a quantum system, even after you made the measurement, until a conscious observer looked at the results in the machine, they could still be in quantum superposition. So this led to the conclusion that consciousness collapses the wave function. This is called the Copenhagen interpretation because Niels Bohr was from Denmark and from Copenhagen, and it became known as the Copenhagen interpretation, also von Neumann, Wigner, and more recently Henry Stapp, that consciousness causes collapse of the wave function. Now the problem with this is it puts consciousness outside science as some mysterious entity. Now, before I leave this, let me say that what we think happens is, or actually even that would be consistent with the idea that consciousness is on the boundary between the quantum and the classical, on this S-shaped curve, the transition between quantum and classical. And I think that's true. The question is, which causes which? Now, Erwin Schrödinger, took exception to the idea that consciousness causes collapse. He thought it was a bizarre and silly idea. And so he came up with this thought experiment to show how ridiculous was the notion that consciousness caused collapse. So he said, let's say you have out here a quantum process, like a photon, both going through a half-silvered mirror and being reflected off the half-silvered mirror. It would both go through and not go through. And if it reflected, it would go into the box, trigger the hammer, which broke the vial, released the poison, and killed the cat. But because it both entered and didn't enter, the cat would be both dead and alive until someone opened the box and took a look. And this is the logical deduction from consciousness causing collapse. And as I said, it puts consciousness outside science. So Schrödinger was showing how absurd was this conclusion, but still, after all these years, we can't say that that's not the case. We don't know how large a quantum superposition can become. Well, Penrose had an answer to that, but I'll come to that. But this is known as the Copenhagen interpretation, or the observer effect of quantum mechanics, that consciousness causes collapse. There's some other ideas about this. For example, the multiple worlds hypothesis. The idea that superpositions don't collapse, that if something is in two places at the same time, each one continues and evolves. It's a separation in the underlying structure of reality, in space-time geometry, for example, and continues on and evolves its own new universe. There is no collapse. So every possibility has its own universe, and that there are an infinite number of parallel overlapping universes. And despite the apparent absurdity of this, it's very, very popular among physicists. Now, there's some other theories, but then Roger Penrose came along and said, gave a third distinct possibility, that the separations do occur, just like in multiple worlds, but that the separations are unstable and eventually reach an objective threshold for quantum state reduction. So he called this objective reduction, OR. The idea here is that collapse causes consciousness, the opposite of consciousness causing collapse. So there's a spontaneous collapse, and that gives consciousness. But to get there, he started by saying superposition is separation in underlying reality, like multiple worlds, but the separations are unstable and reduced by the subjective threshold given by the uncertainty principle E equals h over t, avoiding multiple worlds. Now, E is the amount of superposition. You can think of it as the amount of mass separated from itself, the amount of space-time separation, and h is Planck's constant, and t is the time at which collapse will occur. And so it's inversely related, meaning a big superposition will collapse quickly, a small one will take a long, long time. That wasn't all. He also said that each such OR event or collapse is accompanied by subjective experience. Each collapse gives a moment of subjective experience of being, and the choices selected in each collapse were not random, as they were said to be in Copenhagen, for example, but were influenced by what he called Platonic values embedded in the structure of the universe, in space-time geometry. And this is actually very interesting. What it means is that in the case of consciousness, in our consciousness, for example, if we're mindful and thoughtful, when we make a decision, whether it's instinctive or intuitive or thoughtful, our choices may be influenced by Platonic values embedded in the universe. And some people have taken this to mean the way of the Tao, or divine guidance, or something of that nature. It also meant that consciousness is connected to the structure of the universe. Now, these latter things have spiritual connotations, although Roger doesn't talk about that. He leaves it to me to talk about it. But because he just doesn't find it useful and stays out of trouble. Now, what does it mean that consciousness is in the structure of space-time geometry? What is the universe made of? And by the way, Chris's father, Erwin Laszlo, suggested that a very similar thing with the Akashic record being embedded in the structure of the universe. So it's very similar to that, actually. But what is the structure of the universe? So if we, this is actually from Brian Greene's work, and I disagree with him on a number of things, but I borrowed this slide because it shows that if we start at the top and go downward in scale, and we're expanding, and things are actually getting smaller, but I'm showing them as bigger. If you imagine yourself shrinking smaller and smaller, you get to the size of an atom, and then you go smaller and smaller and smaller. Eventually, things might be kind of smooth, but eventually you get to the basement level, the Planck scale, where there's information, where there's coarse irregularity. So there's information embedded at that level, which actually may repeat at multiple levels, all the way up to the level of biology. But then Penrose addressed the question, unlike these other views, how can particles exist in superposition in two or more locations at the same time? And he tackled this problem head on. Nobody else has addressed it. You know, how can things actually be in two places at the same time? It's very bizarre. So to address it, he started off by simplifying space-time and taking four-dimensional space-time, 3 dimensions of space, 1 dimension of time, and bringing in Einstein's general relativity, in which curvature is equivalent to particle location. So Einstein said mass is equivalent to curvature in space-time. He famously predicted that a star behind the sun could be visible during an eclipse, for example, because the mass of the sun would curve the space-time, and you could see it. And then Arthur Eddington, in 1929 or something, went to a mountaintop during an eclipse, and sure enough saw a star known to be behind the sun off to the side because the mass of the sun was curving it. Now that's for large mass, large space-time. Penrose said the same thing's going to apply at very small scales. So for example, a small particle is going to be equivalent to space-time curvature, and he showed this here in 2 dimensions. Now if the particle moves, it means space-time curvature moves. So an oscillation would be 2 alternate space-time curvatures going back and forth, and then a superposition would be the same particle in 2 different locations, and the separated curvatures in space-time geometry. So the curvatures separate and you have two separated curvatures. Now, if these were to continue, you would have the multiple worlds hypothesis. Universe 1, one particle would go to universe 1, and the other particle would go to universe 2. This would be the multiple worlds view. However, Penrose said, no, after a time t, the curvature, the separation in curvature becomes unstable, and one of them will cease to exist, and the other one will be selected at this threshold, E equals h over t, and at that moment, there would be a moment of conscious experience. So that the spontaneous collapses, which would be occurring everywhere, in the microphone, in the table, in the air, all around us, would be happening all the time, giving rise to these moments of consciousness, or in this case, proto-consciousness, because they'd be occurring everywhere, randomly, but without meaning, without cognition, without memory. They wouldn't be connected to anything. They'd be occurring here, there, and everywhere, but never be noticed or never have any impact. And this is kind of like panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is everywhere in the universe. It's kind of like the idea that if you go to the symphony, before they start playing, that every individual musician and his or her instrument is warming up. So you hear random sounds, tones, noise, and isolated notes of an orchestra warming up. You've all heard it. And then they begin to play, and it's a symphony. So the question is, what in the brain turned the disorganized random notes into the symphony that is our consciousness? And that's where I came in and raised the question whether the brain microtubules might be the quantum computers that he needed to orchestrate random proto-conscious OR moments into full, rich, conscious experience, like music. So, and in this case, the perception of the rose, rather than being just a pattern of activity in her brain, would be due to the fact that she was reproducing a particular space-time configuration correlated with the redness of the rose. Much more complicated than just three curvatures, but maybe you'll get the idea. So the actual space-time curvature could be reproduced, so the essence of the redness of the rose would be in her brain, in all of our brains. So could brain microtubules orchestrate random proto-conscious OR moments into full, rich, conscious experience, like music? So in about 1991 or 92, I wrote to Roger Penrose and I said, I said, you have the only actual theory for a proposal for what consciousness is. But you don't have a quantum computer. And he said so in the book. He didn't know what the quantum computer utilizing OR in the brain might be. And I told him about microtubules. I sent some papers that I wrote and suggested that microtubules might be as quantum computers. But I was going to be in England in a few months, and he graciously invited me to meet with him in his office in Oxford, and we started to talk. And soon after that, I invited him to our first consciousness conference in 1994, after which we went to the Grand Canyon, and there's Roger in the yellow shirt and me behind him about to fall into the Grand Canyon. And on the far left is David Chalmers, famous philosopher, and some other friends. And we had a great time. We hiked through the Grand Canyon, and we started to cook up our theory at that time, which we called Penrose Hameroff, because he was the first author on the first paper, orchestrated objective reduction. So the OR from his collapse of the wave function, orchestration implying the microtubules regulate the OR to give the full rich conscious experience, much like the orchestra begins to play. And in that picture, that's from a few years ago at the Stockholm conference, where he was being literally mobbed. I was beginning to worry about him being physically hurt, so I was kind of being his bodyguard at the time. But the basic idea is that inside neurons we have these microtubules, and each tubulin can be a protein qubit, they're called, and that if you reach a threshold, you have a collapse, and bing happens, and consciousness occurs. Or you can look at it this way, that when that happens, it correlates with a collapse in space-time geometry, because really everything is just curvature in space-time geometry. And we refined it a little bit to correlate it with dipole oscillations, quantum dipole oscillations in the microtubule. But the critics said back then, and some still say, although they're wrong for reasons I'll tell you in a second, the brain is too warm, wet, and noisy for delicate quantum effects, for quantum coherence. Because if you try to build a quantum computer in the laboratory, any vibration, any thermal noise, any heat will disrupt the quantum coherence. And so they build these quantum computers at absolute zero temperature, no heat at all. And yet the brain is too warm, wet, and noisy. So we heard about that for a long time. You guys are crazy, the brain's too warm, forget about it. And we said, well, you know, billions of years, the biology probably figured out a way because it would be favorable for evolution. But you know, given that AI was against us and everybody else was against us, they didn't take it seriously. But then about 10 years ago, it was realized that plants use quantum coherence in photosynthesis to make energy and food. So here we see a carrot or any vegetable, any plant. And on the left, you see that the photons are absorbed to a light harvesting complex. The energy is converted to electronic excitations through an FMO protein to a reaction center where the food is made. And in the FMO protein, we see these chromophores, which are pi resonance clouds. And the energy, it turns out, travel through all 7 of these simultaneously. The energy is excitonic energy is in quantum superposition of all possibilities to get through the reaction center. And that allows very efficient transfer, without which we wouldn't have the food, we wouldn't have vegetables for animals to eat, we wouldn't have vegetables to eat, we wouldn't have animals, and life probably wouldn't exist without this. So this quantum coherent transfer occurs among these nonpolar pi resonance clouds. And so this quantum coherence is necessary for life. So if a carrot is smart enough to use quantum coherence, you know, maybe our brains figured it out. And indeed, about a number of years, 5 or 6 years ago, this fellow Anirban Bandyapati, whom I met at Gino's conference in Hong Kong in 2009, did some amazing experiments on microtubules. So what he did was, you see up top here, the red thing is a microtubule, and he used nanotechnology. And this is at ambient temperature, in warm temperature. And of course, the plant photosynthesis is at warm temperature in sunlight. And he put 4 electrodes and used 2 to stimulate and 2 to record. And he found that the microtubule is a good insulator, except when it was stimulated at certain resonant frequencies. So for example, at 8, 10, and 20 megahertz, the microtubule became highly conductive, quite possibly quantum conductive, although there was resistance between the electrode, and also down in the kilohertz. So this showed that there was some resonance in the microtubule that could lead to quantum coherence. They published 3 papers in 2013, 2014. And then he went to MIT and did a similar experiment inside active neurons, putting nanoprobes inside active neurons, and did even more amazing experiments. So over here you see 2 neurons, 1 and 2, with a number of electrodes. And he found these resonances, which are self-similar at different frequencies. And very self-similar at hertz, kilohertz, and megahertz. Then he went down in scale to the microtubule and found very self-similar patterns, kilohertz, megahertz, and gigahertz. So we're going smaller and faster. And by the way, he called these octaves, which is apropos of this room that we're in this building. And also for music, because it's like vibrations changing scale, but it's like a melody playing at different octaves in music. And then at the level of individual tubulins, he got the same thing and even faster, megahertz, gigahertz, and terahertz, the same octaves down here. So then he actually recorded from inside a neuron and down converted it to audible. So I'm going to play this for you, hopefully. So those are the octaves. And you can see it's sweeping across the frequency range. And he calls this the singing of the microtubules. So this would be the background, then variations on this theme would give rise to consciousness. Now this is down converted to make it audible, so it'd be much, much faster. Somebody, after I show this lecture, somebody asked for this file to use in a rock song. So if you hear this in the background of a rock song, you'll know where it came from. So that's the microtubules singing inside neurons. So if we kind of put this together, here's the basic idea that if you start at the level of a neuron and then go to smaller microtubule individual tubulin pathways and the dipoles, and then some other evidence suggests that anesthesia acts to block these dipoles, which is why you lose consciousness, correlating with the same kind of resonant triplets, he calls them, at frequency, at repeating every 2 to 3 orders of magnitude, from the very slow, like the EEG in hertz, through kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz, and terahertz. And in fact, Roger and I suggested in a recent paper that the EEG is actually beat frequencies. You know, like in music, if 2 guitars are slightly off tune, they give a beat. And EEG may be a beat frequency. And other evidence has shown that the EEG is hierarchical. And if you go from the level of neurons on up, but we take this deeper inside the neuron, so we can go into gigahertz, kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz, and then terahertz. Now, what would happen if we continued, since these are vibrations in space-time geometry, if we continued this way, we would go into the structure of the universe itself, and Bing could occur at deeper, faster levels, even possibly independent of biology. And so it's possible, it's conceivable, that, for example, at the time of death or after death, that consciousness can exist at deeper levels of the universe, or that meditative states or altered states, you go deeper into the structure of the universe and then come back to where we normally are. So I'm not advocating the fact that consciousness necessarily exists after life, but I don't think we can rule it out. I don't think anyone can say it's impossible until we know the actual mechanism for consciousness. And if it follows this quantum idea, then it's conceivable that consciousness can exist in the universe independent of biology. And the intensity would get greater as you go deeper down. And it reminds me of that song by the Beatles, the deeper you go, the higher you fly, the deeper you go, which means that as you go deeper into the level of the universe, you get more intense conscious experience. So that's speculative, but again, until we know what consciousness is, we can't say that it doesn't happen outside the body. Okay, what are the practical implications of all this? So as brain microtubules resonate in megahertz, could mental and cognitive disorders be treated by applying megahertz vibrations to the brain? So when I found out about Honorbaum's work in megahertz, I knew at that time that there were various types of non-invasive brain stimulation techniques. For example, transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS shown on the left, transcranial electrical, both direct current and alternating current. This was being used to treat depression, and improve cognition. Gamers were using this to improve their ability to play games, and they tried it on pilots to see if they could react quicker and so forth. And with sort of mixed results. But then I wondered, well, had anybody put megahertz into the brain? And megahertz in electromagnetic is radio waves, and I wasn't interested in that. But in mechanical vibrations, it's ultrasound. So, which is used in medicine, has been used in medicine for many, many years. For example, to image fetuses in the uterus, and in anesthesia, we use it to find the jugular vein or to find nerves, to do nerve blocks. And the ultrasound passes into the body, echoes off structures, and you get an image, as we see here, of the fetus. So I looked up to see if anybody had put ultrasound into the brain and to look for effects. And this guy, Jamie Tyler, had actually did the first transcranial ultrasound in animals, in rats, and he showed behavioral effects. He stimulated the cortex here, the paw would move, and electrophysiological effects. And he developed the first ultrasound headset device, and he started a couple companies, both for ultrasound and electrical stimulation. And he designed these headsets. They got nicer, and you can see if you wear one of these headsets, you get sexy and beautiful immediately. And he raised a lot of money for his companies to change his mood with ultrasound and electricity. Mostly he's been focusing on electricity. So I was talking to my colleagues in anesthesia, said, you know, we should try this on our chronic pain patients who are depressed and see if it enhances their mood. And my colleague said, you know, we don't try it on anybody until we try it on ourselves. You got a shaved head, it's your idea, you go first. And I had to admit he had a point, and so I did. And one day I let my friend do it, and started to me, you might say, and here's my brain on ultrasound using an imaging device. And when I first did it, I didn't feel anything. You don't feel it, and I didn't feel anything. I put it down and said, well, that's too bad. It's not going to work. And then about a minute later, I got a buzz, and I felt really, really good for about an hour. I was literally buzzed for an hour. And I said, okay, we should try this on our chronic pain patients, and so we did. And we published, and we found improved mood. We did a visual analog mood scale, and found that 15 seconds of ultrasound at subthermal. We're very careful to be below the thermal level. We don't want to heat the brain. At high intensity, you can't heat the brain. But that 15 seconds right frontotemporal at subthermal intensity results in about 40 minutes of increased mood by this global affect scale. And subsequently, I got my other colleagues involved, and we did a number of studies. We showed that the ultrasound propagates across the brain, so it does penetrate the brain quite nicely at low intensity. And we did further studies with these colleagues here. For example, here we compared waveform A was 30 seconds, waveform B was 30 minutes. So it turns out that you're better off with short stimulation rather than long stimulation, and both were better than placebo. We also tried it at the vertex, and we found no effect on mood overall, but some subjects had uncontrolled laughter. They wouldn't stop laughing. I said, you want us to stop? They said, no, no, no. Increased mindfulness by non-attachment scale and out-of-body experiences. So that's interesting. And we showed that 2 megahertz versus placebo gave a clear improved mood after 30 minutes and probably longer. And then this paper came out. Don't bother reading it. I'll just tell you the bottom line is that these people in Australia were using ultrasound to open the blood-brain barrier and putting in microbubbles to get a drug across that they wanted to treat Alzheimer's in these animals that had genetically induced Alzheimer's. And they had a control group that they only gave the ultrasound without the microbubbles and without the drug, and they got better. They got markedly better, actually. Their amyloid plaques went away, and their symptoms, they measured their memory and their cognition, and they got better. So these mice got better with their Alzheimer's. They said it should be explored further with therapeutic potential in Alzheimer's disease, but that it would take a few years to figure out how it could be safely used. And I wrote to them, I said, hey, we've been doing this for a couple of years, and let's get on with it. And since Alzheimer's is when your microtubules fall apart, and Anirban showed, for example, that 2 megahertz, actually this is electromagnetic, but the 2 megahertz causes microtubules to assemble at maximal length. So that's interesting. So 2 megahertz is pretty good for causing microtubules to assemble. And then my colleague Sadviki Gupta in India did an assay of assembling microtubules and then bringing them to and then letting them cool to room temperature, and they disassemble. So the black triangles, they start to disassemble. She's measuring their assembly with optical density. But when she gave them ultrasound in the red, they stayed assembled. They didn't fall apart. suggesting that ultrasound can stabilize it. And then, well, before that, I met Sterling Cooley, who is here, who started making, he's in the back there, who started making devices specifically for transcranial ultrasound, and has been developing them, and he's been working here in Shenzhen. And his model is called the neuroresonator. Maybe it's a different name now. And here's the circuit for it. But his device is optimal. I think will be optimal for treating the brain because number one, it uses honor bonds frequencies and it has a lot of controls that you can do. And so we are starting a study at the University of Arizona on using transcranial ultrasound for Alzheimer's and brain injury. And another study showed that ultrasound actually promotes connections among neurons. So we'll see it's painless, it's safe at low intensity, fairly inexpensive, and could be widely used. So we'll see what happens over the next 6 months or so with that study. So let me conclude by saying three things that, in my opinion, based on my work with Roger Penrose, that the brain is something like a quantum orchestra, and consciousness is something like music in the structure of the universe. Not so much a computer, more like music in an orchestra. And it's possible that consciousness can exist independent of biology. I don't claim that. I don't have claim any evidence. Many other people do. We just don't know yet, but it's not impossible. And finally, the transcranial ultrasound, TUS, which is also the airport code for Tucson, Arizona, and I think of that, I'm proud to say, can resonate brain microtubules, offering hope for depression, Alzheimer's disease, traumatic brain injury, and other disorders. And finally, I think Fionn and Gino might have mentioned the conferences we have, which are interdisciplinary conferences on consciousness. We've been doing it since 1994, in even-numbered years in Tucson, odd-numbered years elsewhere around the world. Gino, you hosted the 2009 conference in Hong Kong, and we had the 2015 in Helsinki. The 2016 conference will be back in Tucson, and here's the flyer for it. And everybody's invited, of course. There's the website. We have an amazing list of speakers and workshops and topics, and we really take it's going to be in a fabulous resort in the hills above Tucson, and we have a lot of fun. We have a lot of entertainment, and people have been coming for many, many years, so it's kind of a community and network. And finally, the 2017 conference we've just decided will be here in Shanghai with thank you. Gino's help and Crystal Globe and Fudan University and another university. So yes. So it'll be here. We haven't fixed the dates yet, but we're close to doing that. So it'll be in the spring of 2017, and obviously you're all invited to that. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. You've been a great audience.